to start? Let's have Josh start. Whenever you're ready.
Are we recording this one or not?
Are we recording? Okay.
Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. So Mayor, thank you, and council members, thank you. This is the second budget workshop for the 2023-2024 biennial budget. As we did at the first workshop, we are going to just linger here on the agenda for a minute. We'll be starting with budget themes, jumping into budget summary, going to a levy overview, which will be a little bit of follow-up on some stuff we talked about at the first workshop, and then we'll be diving into budget highlights and wrapping up with next steps or council action. So kind of as a reminder from the first workshop again, the budget themes that we've constructed this budget around are fiscal sustainability or financial sustainability, which is really more of a carryover from the previous budget. It's just something we want to obviously continue to espouse and build into our budgets. And as I mentioned too, we've got a couple of measures, recent measures that would suggest we're going into the next biennial budget from a position of fiscal strength. We had our financial statement presentation for fiscal year 21 that our auditors gave in July. And we had our recent credit opinion that Moody's gave us when we borrowed both our 2022C and 22D borrowings, general obligation of water utility revenue bonds. Whether it's the financial statement or the credit opinion that we received for both of those borrowings, all of those kind of measures or metrics which would suggest that we're approaching this next biennial budget from a position of fiscal strength. Our job then really is through the budgeting and implementation of the budgeting once we get into fiscal year 23 is to really just keep that up. We're making investments in the future through this next biennial budget. So there are a number of projects we'll touch on a little bit later that are in the 2022 through 2026 capital improvement plan that are incorporated into this biennial budget. A couple of projects of note are the Man Valley Corporate Park Development and the Biosolids Facility. Design is underway on both of those. And so the 23-24 biennial budget then would be us implementing the actual projects once we get the design for those. And then information technology is the third theme in this biennial budget. So we've made significant investments in IT. We did an internal reallocation within the organization to add an FTE in the IT department, which you would find represented in the IT fund. And we also are making capital investments through our IT fund. So we are going to procure new servers, and we're going to be doing server upgrades to ensure that we continue to stay as up to date as possible in terms of cybersecurity, both for not only our internal customers or our city employees, but also for our external customers when it comes to our utilities and our SCADA network and things of that nature. So those are the three budget themes where we've constructed this around. So now to start with budget summary and to do some biennial budget comparisons, the proposed 2023-2024 biennial budget totals $96,910,201. That is a large increase compared to the adopted 21-22 budget. Part of the reason for that, though, is if you were to look at the 2019-2020 adopted budget and you look at that capital projects row, we did make a significant reduction in those expenses in 21-22 as a result of kind of our reaction to the ongoing COVID pandemic and reducing expenses. Other notable increases, though, for the 23-24 biennial budget include one additional FTE in the general fund, what we characterize as sort of a pot of money that's intended for contractual services as needed, as needs across the organization kind of change and we need to bring on a little bit of additional support into the organization. We do have some contractual services built into the budget for that. And then of course, compensation and health insurance increases across the board. For the special revenue funds, a lot of the increase you're seeing there really comes down to the fact that we're adding several new funds into this biennial budget that did not exist in the last biennial budget. For example, the ARPA fund. Council approved an ARPA spending plan recently, and so this biennial budget then implements that spending plan. And to do so, we established a new special revenue fund where that ARPA money is currently segregated. So that's in this budget. The street lighting fund that we talked about at the last workshop is in this budget as well. There again, we established a separate fund where the street lighting revenue and the street lighting expenses would be segregated and tracked separately. So there is again a separate fund for that built into this budget. And then we have funds for kids 17 and 18, which just would not have existed at the time that the 21-22 biennial budget was put together in the first place. So though the addition of those funds account for a large majority of the special revenue fund increase you see there. The capital projects increase from the previous biennial budget to this one largely are due to the South Lawson Lane reconstruction and Powell Avenue Bridge redeck projects. Both of those are in Fund 410, which is our general capital fund. And so you do see a lot of the large increase for the capital projects row there is tied to those two projects. And I'll touch on these projects again shortly, and you'll see the figures for those. And then the enterprise funds, we do have a large increase for electric purchased power in 2023 and 24 compared to the last, or I guess technically the current biennial budget. And then the interest portion of 2022D revenue bonds that we just borrowed, we do budget for the interest portion of those repayments. Those are included in this budget. The electric purchased power and the interest portion of our 2022D bonds represent about $1.7 million of the total increase. So as you go through those funds, then there's not, besides those things I've just pointed out, there's not really any one thing you can point to and say this represents then a large amount of the remaining increase. It's really just inflationary increase across the board in a number of the accounts and all of the rest of the enterprise funds. And then the internal service funds, as I mentioned, a lot of that really comes down to the investments in information technology that we're making that I touched on earlier. So again, we do have the internal reallocation of 1 FTE in the internal service fund that would be represented here, as well as the investments in new servers, server upgrades. Our city hall fund and facilities funds, which are also internal service funds, do have some capital projects built into their budgets that are represented here as well.
Josh, can I ask something real quick? And I'm sorry, excuse me for coming in late, and you maybe already talked about it, but I just heard you say something about added increases due to electrical. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, so that's really us accounting for the increases in purchased power that we're seeing from WPPI. So we're essentially projecting ongoing increases for that are likely above and beyond inflation otherwise that are built into this budget. Actually Kevin just walked in, but we, you know, it's a budget, it's a plan. As kind of the macroeconomic environment unfolds, you know, we may not necessarily see increases in purchase power that we budget, obviously, but we are anticipating significant increases there. So those are included in the budget.
What percentage is that?
I would have to dig into the detail and get back to you on that, but the purchase power, and then like I mentioned earlier, the interest portion of our 2022D revenue bonds represent about $1.7 million of the total increase in our enterprise funds. So I would say about over the 2-year period, over $1 million, 1.2, 1.3 million. Because the interest portion of those revenue bonds are going to be about $200,000 roughly per year. Or 400,000 roughly over both years. So,
wow. Okay, thank you.
Absolutely.
So 450,000 increase in the 2-year budget of purchase power from 21-22 to the 23-24 budget. Or I'm sorry, 21-22 projected. So the budget was 17.8. For 21-22, we project, given the inflation, it's going to be at 19.4 million. So pretty big increase from what we budgeted originally for purchase power. And then jumping our projection from these 2 years, up by 400,000 into the next 2 years. WPPI is projecting something on the order of a 10 to 12% increase in wholesale power purchase costs.
And that's what that is about, what you said, that increase, about 10, 12.
So, I mean, that's what they're budgeting, that's what we're budgeting.
Mm-hmm.
We're hoping that we budgeted too high, but it's not unreasonable to think that we actually budgeted too low if things don't, we don't catch it by the tail at some point.
I got some questions regarding budget comparisons, and I know maybe other council members do too. When you look at previous library budgets, we used to fund at 14%, and it's dropped. Now, to what you said, Josh, you talked about contractual services. I know that the library board, we're looking very hard at improvements to it, and I believe that we could probably use what you call flex spending, but the current funding doesn't allow for it. And I think it's important to know why we would need what I call that flex spending. So I'm looking at more of a 12% funding instead of what we're currently at, and I'll explain why. We're looking at finding community partners such as art museum, or not art museum, I'm sorry, historical museum, and maybe even Pierce County Historical. I don't know if other council members know about that, but that is something the board is seriously looking at, as well as other community partners the library board will be looking at potentially bringing on to help it more in the future. These decisions, though, I think will need sustained funding. That's why I use the word flex funding to get it back to what we call maybe, I don't think 14% is going to happen, but I think meeting somewhere in the middle would be really comfortable for what I call traditional levels of funding from our city. Could keep at if it's possible. I need a question to our library director. What are we losing if we drop from 12% to where we're at currently?
Yeah. I am going to be very cautious of the fact that your time is valuable and don't be intimidated by the paperwork because I don't intend to go through it all, but I wanted to add it here.
So can we?
Well,
Yeah,
because
Yeah.
the library's on the agenda.
Yeah, we're about
We
8
do
slides
actually have
away
some.
from.
So can we-
Meet someplace else at 6:30?
Oh,
That's-
well, that's
I'm
good
just
to
trying
know.
to call me. Okay.
Oh,
I'll
okay.
just come until you're ready.
Maybe we can move it up after the.
Okay.
That's up
Thank
to the
you.
council,
No
so
problem.
we can go on any order you want.
We do have a slide coming, I can.
We're going macro to micro.
Yeah.
And we're not to the micro yet.
Yes.
So why don't you keep moving along, and if we can get there soon, then we can.
I'll look
skip
for
ahead.
a wave or something.
Or a different way to segue.
So I wanted to follow up on a point of discussion we spent quite a bit of time on in the last workshop. So we had talked about the levy limit challenges that we as a city face. And what I've attempted to do is map out exactly what that looks like for us, going back to 2021, but then projecting forward to 2026. So there's a lot going on here. So I'm going to just briefly walk through kind of what you're looking at. Each of those stacked columns, the one on the left-hand side for each year, 21 through 2026, the blue column represents the levy that we envisioned in the fiscal plan. The right-hand column, or green column, then represents the levy that was in our budget and adopted by council, is proposed as part of the 23-24 biennial budget, and then is kind of projected moving forward for 25 and 26. Understanding, of course, that this next year we will be coming back and doing a fiscal plan review and update where those 25 and 26 bars will likely look different than they do right now, but those are there for some context. Each of the shaded colors within the blue and the green columns represent, going from bottom to top, the general fund portion of the levy, the libraries portion of the levy, debt service portion, and then capital portion of the levy. So now I'm going to call your attention to the lines that are moving across this chart. So the bottom green line represents the base portion of our levy limit. So as we discussed at the last workshop, we have two main components of our state imposed levy limit. You have the base portion, and then you have an allowance based on how much general obligation debt you're paying in the fiscal year. So another way of saying this, I guess, is the levy limit system is currently constructed to some degree encourages general obligation indebtedness for communities in the state. So Moving up from that base portion then of the levy to the red line, you have your levy limit with existing general obligation borrowing. So that was as of December 31st, 2021, how much general obligation debt we were paying each year. The next line up, or the blue line then, would be our levy limit with proposed borrowing. So that actually does include the borrowing that we just did this year, the general obligation portion of that. And then going into 2024, it does include an anticipated or a proposed borrowing for some projects that we are going to show you on a slide. It would primarily be biosolids facility, Man Valley, and possibly some advances to kids 15 and 16 that we made in the prior year. So what we want to demonstrate here is if you look at that red line, you can see that in 2021 and 2022, both the fiscal plan and adopted levies were underneath that line. So we were underneath our levy limit, we were good. And if you were to go further back in time, that would have continued to be the case, and that gap would be bigger and bigger the further back you go. Because your debts, obviously your payment in any one year is tapering as your debt gets paid off. The issue we ran into, the challenge we ran into was in 2023, what was in our fiscal plan with what we had for general obligation debt payments as of 12/31/21, we would have actually gone above our levy limit. Fortunately, to some degree, because of the borrowing that we did, in fact, we just closed on it today. Because of that borrowing, we do now have capacity again underneath the limit. So our 2023 levy is okay. Our 2024 levy, what's proposed in the fiscal plan, would likely come right at, if not slightly above that limit, but what's in your budget does not. It will be under the limit. And with what we're borrowing for Man Valley and for the biosolids facility and how much we're estimating or planning for that to be general obligation borrowing, you can see then what that line will continue to do. How much it increases in 24 and 25 depends on how much of that Man Valley borrowing we do in those years. Right now, we're assuming at least $5 million in 2023. We'll continue to get more information as design progresses. But right now, we're assuming about $5 million of that borrowing occurs in 2023 for our payments to start in 24. So that's why the blue line continues to move upwards. The base portion of the levy, I just want to call one last thing out before I stop talking about this slide. That base portion of the levy, our ability to increase that goes back to our net new construction. So as you all recall, in this year, 2022, we had 4.141% net new construction, which for this community is large. I think going back to the records that are on the Department of Revenue's website, which go back to 2013, it's the highest since at least then, and possibly further back beyond that. That number is key for us to increase the base portion of our levy. That is pretty much the primary driver of that base portion increase in the levy limit formula. So that's why you see a relatively large jump there in that green line in 23, but then in 24, 25, and 26, as per our fiscal plan, we are only assuming a 1% increase in net new construction. Now that likely is conservative, given everything that's happening in this community. But to be conservative, we are estimating 1% growth there in that base portion that ties back to net new construction. So this is a visual representation of something we spent quite a bit of time talking about at the last workshop.
So this is invention of Josh and I's brain, because I wanted to try to get a check on reality about how far, so we can game the levy limit. I mean, we are smarter than the state of Wisconsin, so we can figure out a way to game the system. But if you start to do too much game in the system, and you're keeping track of what's the real story versus what's the story going on in our book, so to speak. And I don't mean like we're doing any kind of show games or anything, but if our definitions of base and the state's definition of base get far apart, it limits our flexibility over the long term to deal with anything that comes up. Because the state's definition of base includes what we consider the general fund and the library. So the concern for me as the administrator is we would want this line above the library and the general fund, because then our definition of base and the state's definition of base would be the same. And then our debt service would be the only thing in between these two lines. And that way, if we decided, you know what, we're gonna ease off on our debt because we don't want all these obligations going out for future generations, we can do that without affecting our ability to do some additional levy for the base. And so it's important when this gets spread out, because that just means now all of a sudden your levy has to have a huge percentage towards debt. You know, you're taking more and more mortgage out. But it's also a concern when you start to see these bars jumping above that line. And it's one of the reasons why in the fiscal plan, we planned on a lot more base operating levy and less debt. And we had to bring those numbers down. And as you'll see in our budget, the one we brought down is the general fund portion of the levy. The library levy is very similar, or actually a little bit more than the projected, but we had to get that bar closer because I'm worried about this base definition that the state has. So this is the one that only can go up by that net new construction under the current formula. Well, the chances of our, expenses for personnel, supplies and other things tracking below or at 1% are very challenging. So then you start relying more on debt to get your levy up to where you need it. But all the while you're moving this line farther from what the state considers base. So again, we can game the system. I'm not comfortable. That's why we've left room here, because we really felt we had to keep this down. So you could either move up your base, the library, the base, but I'm still worried about that debt service piece kind of fitting in between those lines, because otherwise we don't have long-term flexibility. And then the gaming of the system. And when I say gaming of the system, again, I'm not saying we're doing anything illegal or immoral, or the state sees exactly what we're doing. It's transparent in the process, but you could do that for 3-4 years for sure. I mean, I wouldn't be worried to get to 27, 28. It's not a big deal, but you just start drawing that difference apart in those graphs, and then 28, 29, 30, 31, you have to rely on some catastrophic change to the formula, which hasn't happened since 1987 or something, or you have to go to referendum to blow it apart or something. So this may not be as interesting to you as it is to me, but it's like we had to figure out a way to stack these two things and figure out what does the state think we're doing for levy limits, what do we think we're doing for levy limits, and how are those tracking across time? And then this turns into then a legislative ask to say, this is ridiculous. I mean, you're telling us spend as much as you want as long as you go take out debt. Don't do any reasonable fiscal planning. Just either don't tax, which is an option that many legislators would be happy with. Just stay under that green bar and everything will be good, except for you'll have to cut all your services because it costs more to do the services. Or just take out a bunch of debt. So what you're seeing in other cities is they've got their operating bars way down here, and then this is all filled with debt. And they have no real way out other than to just keep refinancing their debt. And that's why they're talking about in Milwaukee, instead of cutting 10% of the police officers, because they debt finance as much as they can leverage. At some point you run out of the debt game, And now you just have to go back at the bottom of your bars, so, or at the bottom of your, bar chart there. So that, let's see, I'm trying to see how we get to library. Go, we can do library before we do fees, so maybe you wanna do the next slide, next two slides pretty quickly here.
And easy, because this is one we talked about at the last workshop. So as you recall, this is our proposed net levy. So the gross levy increase in 2023 compared to 22 is 5.27%. But when you factor in net new construction and the amount of our levy that we're able to increase because of that net new construction, the net levy increase then is 2.59%. And basically because of what you're seeing on this previous chart, in that decrease from 23, or that widening gap between fiscal plan and proposed budget levy, that plays a role in what you then see on this chart. So the gross levy increase is 1.62% from 23 to 24, and including that net new construction amount, the net increase is 0.98%. With an estimated tax bill based on a $250,000 residence. And again, some other assumptions at the bottom there, where we're talking city portion only, so it excludes other taxing jurisdictions, and it includes tax increment, the TIF portion, the tax increment financing portion of the levy. We assume a Pierce County residence here, and it assumes net new construction of 1% for 2024. You can see that the projected city tax bill in 23 is $1,448 for city portion, and in 2024 it's $1,457, which in total represents a $50 increase overall from 2022 to 2024. So just to revisit that slide, and I will jump ahead to library. So this slide, we're getting into the proposed library levy here then. So the library levy represented 12% of the total levy in 2020, or $855,000. In 2023, with the proposed budget, the library portion of the levy represents 11.5% of the total and 11.4% of the total in 2024. In both years, in terms of dollar amounts, $867,000, or an increase of $12,000 from 2020, or $17,000 from 2022. The fiscal plan target, as a reminder, calls for the library portion of the levy to be 10% of the total, which in 2023 would be approximately $751,000 of a $7.5 million total levy. So that's this slide, and I will pause for conversation and discussion.
So you had a question?
Yeah, I was curious, between our traditional funding we've had in the past and today, if it were to be at 12% instead of 11.5, what are we losing? And could Tanya answer that?
I would like to answer that, and I will be brief. So I want to be clear that Rebecca and Wayne and I have accepted the revenue for the library for the next 2 years, but it is not sustainable. And I'm hoping that that the board and I can build a better bridge of communication one-on-one with the council to explain on a more granular level why this is not going to work for the long run. Having said that, I have to qualify just a little bit by explaining what I found in my research. So there is a big difference between gross and net percentage of the levy. When I have gone out, we are now going to be paying about $180,000 in administrative fees out of the original allocation. So we pay money back into general funds for finance, for HR, for facilities staffing, and IT staffing, and that amounts to $180,000. So when I checked across the state similar size libraries, meaning the community is a similar size, and the highest one was $95,000, and that one was kind of an anomaly. So we are twice over that, and I actually don't have a problem with $180,000. I understand people have to be paid. The problem is that what we are actually netting is about 8.95% of the levy after you take out the administrative fees. And that is just not sustainable for us. I also learned that we have far fewer FTE than Hudson. And even though we have more librarians, we actually are paying $21,000 less a year in wages and Social Security and healthcare. All those things added up, $21,000 less than Hudson, which quite frankly, well, I won't even qualify that. So we can't reduce staffing anymore. Can we, every time a librarian retires, we can look at alternatives, but the reason we are able to hold it together is because we have 5 master's degree level librarians who have their entire heart into that library, and we are able to hold it together with few staffing because of that. So we have to be really careful not to tip that over. So just to answer the question that was posed, and then I'll move on. I'm not going to drag you through all these documents. It's your bedtime reading. All right, so the first column, I'm not sure is super relevant, but it's a comparison. The first column in red is the 2022 budget. There were some anomalies in that budget, which makes it a little bit difficult to compare line by line. But then if you go to the last column, that's the agreement we have made with the city. So looking at the total levy is the first row. The second row is the amount that the library is being allocated. And that is a gross of 11.57% of the levy. But then when you take out, and actually this 195, I think is closer to 180 now. Anyway, so I'll keep going as it's 195. So that actually leaves us with $671,000. And it brings us down almost to 9% of the levy, which is where we're operating right now. And not only is it taking us down to 9% of the levy in net, it's also dipping in $25,000 into our reserve fund, which I also don't have a problem with. When during difficult times, we use reserve funds. Next year, it's $50,000 in reserve funds. That is not sustainable. So I have some scenarios here in the middle columns. I have 12.25% of the levy, knowing that it actually comes down closer to 9.63 net. Then I have 12% of the levy, that knowing that it comes down to 9.38 net. And then the 11.75 column is about 913 net, but it also involves us using $10,000 out of our reserve fund. So I'm going to have you turn the page, just one page. Those kind of yellow highlighted columns are rows, the yellow highlighted rows. Those are really the only rows that I have any choice in the matter. The other ones, I really don't. So I want to be able to point out to you what the losses are for the library. And I'm really going to skip down because the primary losses are going to be in our book collections. So we're going to be moving down from $56,000 to $46,000 in books. We're going to be moving down from 10,500 DVDs to 5,000. And even though DVDs are going out of style, they're still the most popular circulation that we have at the library. They're still hot. It's a strange thing, but I think it's because of the internet. Periodicals will be going down from 9,500 to 6,500. Audio materials, books and CDs will be going down from 7,500 to 3,000. Compact disc will be going down from 3,000 to 1,500. Electronic media, which is like, we have an investment database called Value Line. It's something we subscribe to separately because our patrons like to have access to those electronic databases. So we're gonna be going from 5,480 to 4,000. And then programming from 9,300 to 3,000. So, and this is while still going $25,000 into reserve. So I'm going to quit with that. The next document is the research that I did with Rebecca and Wayne of comparative libraries. And the document after that is, if you really wanted to get granular, that is exactly what we spend those budget lines on. I thank you for the opportunity to speak in front of you. Enjoy your job.
Hey, what's programming?
Pardon me?
What's programming?
So programming is summer library program. It's presenters. It's anything that the children's librarian might need in terms of materials for a program. So it's that. The one thing we have going for us in the program area is that we get about $20,000 a year from the foundation. It helps a lot. So I could go from 9,000 to 3,000 without having a heart attack because I know we have that. We spend a lot on programming. And we also don't have necessarily a technology line, so that $20,000 also pays for all the technology that we have available for patrons. So.
I have another question for you. What's the value return on the dollar from the library in this sense?
Well, there's a lot of research out there that says at minimum it's for every dollar you invest in the library, there's $7 in return.
Now, if we were to do something where we know we don't have the staff to watch the art gallery downstairs, but if we were to move that upstairs, there's a couple locations I know that you guys are interested in, and have like a historical museum and partner maybe with Pierce County Historical. Having some flex spending, I suspect, would actually bring in a significant amount of money, right? Where you would actually have these other community partners, maybe have a business down there too, maybe like a coffee house or something.
So I guess the answer would be, if we're talking about how much these other organizations or businesses are paying for using the building, it depends on what the value of that is. But it will also bring in more patrons. When you bring in more patrons, you end up with higher circulation. That lifts Act 150 funding. When you lower the operation cost of the library, it lowers Act 150 funding, which is one good reason to keep those administrative funds in the budget.
See, I think that value return on the dollar from 1 to 7 actually turns into 1 to 10 when you have a couple community partners in there. You know what I mean?
I would say pretty easily. I'd have to take a look at that formula, but 1 to 7 is the lowest estimate for that.
Okay. All right, thanks, Tom.
Yeah.
I'll let Josh keep going. We can come back to questions. I gotta step out, I'm sorry, take a call here, but, what we need to. You wanna go back to these slides?
Yep.
When we get back to the library, then.
Yep.
Hopefully I'll be back.
No, it's fine. So
Scott.
this slide presents the unassigned fund balance. So we're kind of coming back to kind of that macro level Scott described earlier. And we talked about levy, talked about the net levy, the estimated tax bill. Another one of those kind of macro measures we like to look at with the biennial budget is the unassigned fund balance within the general fund. And so again, we're going back in time on the left-hand side of the chart, and then we're working our way through the last year of this proposed biennial budget. So the left-hand column represents the minimum fund balance of 40%. Now, as you recall, in October of 2021, that fund balance policy was revised. What used to be a minimum fund balance threshold of 50% was reduced to 40, and we established 50% as the target fund balance. So that left-hand column is actually revised based on the revised fund balance policy. So And then the fund balance target of 50%, which again, in the past, is as of October of last year, at least would have been the minimum, is now represented as this dashed line moving from left to right as the target. So the right-hand column, then you've got the darker blue column, and then you've got the lighter blue column on the right there for each year. What that is the actual unassigned fund balance as of the end of each year. So you can see in 2020, we exceeded what would have been at the time, the minimum fund balance target of 50%. And then in 2021, you see this drawdown. What occurred there, and then that drawdown in part prompted the revision to the fund balance policy. Now, we still actually ended the year at 52%, so we still finished the year above 50%. We do expect that to potentially, I shouldn't even say expect, it may change in 2022, as you recall, when we talked about the fiscal plan at a workshop. This would have been back in May or June, I believe. We talked about how the 2022 portion of the fiscal plan, the revision, it contemplates a drawdown of $355,000 in fund balance. We're tracking right now where we may not actually need that, and that was just a one-time drawdown that's not built in structurally into our biennial budget. So that would have been the one-time drawdown in 22. But what occurred in 21 that prompted the revision in the policy were the advances to kids 15 and 16, which was $1.4 million. So getting into 2023 then and 2024, on that right-hand column, you see a lighter shaded blue up there that goes up and beyond the fund balance target of 50%. What we're proposing there is, and I'm going to work with Ellers to kind of map this out, but we're contemplating local bank financing for the $1.4 million that was previously advanced to kids 15 and 16. Now that's accomplishing two things. One is it's bringing our fund balance up to what it was prior to the advance occurring, and it's also contemplated being issued as a general obligation promissory note. So when we talked about that whole levy limit formula and the challenge we face with the indebtedness and how that factors into the levy limit policy that the state sets, the formula, this will increase our capacity, and that's actually built in. I'm going to go back here again. I apologize, but that's contemplated in this 2024 portion of that blue line, that upper limit. That's factored into that. That's part of our planned borrowing in 23. And then it also brings our fund balance in the general fund back up. I guess another way of saying this was in 2021, we may have instead just borrowed local bank financing instead of advancing the money, given the challenges we were facing with the levy limit formula. So this would be essentially kind of undoing the advance, bringing the fund balance back up for the general fund, and increasing that upper levy limit that we have under the formula. So that's what you're seeing there in 2023 and 2024. That's kind of this kind of almost dramatic boomerang you're seeing there. And so the projected growth in unassigned fund balance in 23 and 24 does not assume any use of budgeted contingency in either of those years, which is a key assumption to call out. So you have contingency that's incorporated into each of our budgets. We're anticipating no use of that. So I just want to point that out. I don't think that's atypical from any other year. I think that's quite typical, but it's worth pointing out because it is an assumption baked into each of our biennial budgets.
Now, why wouldn't we just go back to a 50% fund balance minimum? I mean, that's effectively what we're doing.
It certainly is a policy question for the council and something certainly that would be at your discretion to do.
Yeah, I thought the conversation was around the one-time, well, the conversation was first around, do we retain our credit ratings? Do we retain our AA one,
For general obligation, we're AA2.
AA2, so do we retain our AA2 by going to 40? And then what are we gonna do? And again, I've said this 100 times, a pot of money in search of a project is poor fiscal policy. What are we gonna do with it? If we're not gonna do anything with it, then let's just raise it back to 50%. That'd be my opinion. I mean, I'm not gonna make a decision today, but I don't know why we wouldn't. If we're not gonna, if something doesn't present itself for us to use, then the 40% is irrelevant.
And I think I think the delicate balance that the city has historically tried to find is obviously utilizing cash in lieu of borrowing to the extent that we've got a fund balance policy that accommodates it. And of course, locking the balance in terms of your total general obligation indebtedness, because there are state limits for that. And then we actually have a local limit, which is half of the state limit. So there's always this balance of minding the city's unrestricted fund balance and the general obligation limit that we have set by statute. And then, like I said, further restricted here at the local level. And so I can certainly understand the balance we've been walking. And one of the things we heard during the credit call when we just went through the credit rating process was, even at 40%, they certainly understood the policy decision to revise it down. They considered 40% to still be very strong relative to other local governments of our size and beyond. And, certainly there is some benefit to having the liquidity available. We're not necessarily here saying that I think, okay, you just reduced it to 40. Now let's go ahead and drive it down to this new threshold. So that's certainly not at all what we envision doing. And even here, if we were to leave the policy at 40, I don't believe what we're necessarily proposing is to set the fund balance back up above 50, but then find projects to spend it on. I think it's there if it's needed. Walking that balance we've always historically walked in terms of how much do we want to advance to TIDS versus borrow. The additional complicating factor, of course, that just recently entered this picture was the levy limit situation. And so
Yeah, I get it.
So that's the multifaceted balancing act we're kind of walking here. So we would bring it back up with the idea that we then have the liquidity should it be necessary in future years. We're not anticipating any need for that by doing this. It's just bringing the fund balance back up and borrowing, which, perhaps that's the direction we could have gone in the first place, given the levy limit challenge we had come in. But here we are, and so this is in part what we're proposing.
And that's in part of that to do with the comp plan too, as far as that goes, right, Josh? Anticipation of some of those.
Well, I mean, again, certainly with fund balance that large, if we're that high above, if the policy minimum limit remains 40 and now we're above 50 and then some, again, we would have liquidity available, we have cash available. We're not saying though that we have anything in mind for that here. We'll continue to assess on an annual basis that balancing act I just described, I guess.
Intuitive to borrow money and put it in cash without doing anything with it.
Well, and
I'm not being critical by any means, but it goes against every professional aspect of my life.
those advances obviously were originally done for development incentives.
Right.
And so I would say that the cash has been utilized. It really just comes down to, did we want it to be internal borrowing or external borrowing? And how does that influence the levy limit if it's general obligation external borrowing versus fund balance policy if it's internal?
But 2 years later, it seems like we absorbed it just fine and kept moving.
Yeah, I mean, again, with the anticipated in the fiscal plan revision drawdown of $355,000 in 22, we do show that we would have fallen below the old policy. So it makes sense. But again, we can bring it back up over 50 with this proposed borrowing and address all the other aspects of the balancing act we talked about.
Yeah.
That will ultimately obviously be your
And I
call.
I get the need, I get the ridiculousness of the state levy limits. Yeah, I get that piece, but it just makes my head.
Well, there are cities out there that are, they're doing like short-term, like 1-year notes to try to get around limits like this, so it's.
And they don't have any cash,
No, I know.
so they are in trouble, because that's why this year, I think there's 4 or 5 referendums on the November ballot to exceed the levy limits. Because they just kept having this PowerPoint for their council, and at some point, they're like, and theirs looks a lot worse than ours, because they don't have cash, they got 10% or 15% operating cash. They're over 50% of their levy is in debt, so they don't have any, so they, at some point, it's like, it's not bad management, it's just you're being told
That rules.
to go that way, and it doesn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah, I'm not being critical by any means.
And there is policy, just, you all still have policy tools. There's levers and knobs that you still can tell us, and we're happy to accommodate and have the ability to accommodate, so. This council could say, we want to spend the cash down, now's the time to do it, we want to do whatever. There's not enough to build a fire station, if that's what you're thinking. I saw somebody back there.
Hey, you're new.
But it's enough to say we want to do this or that or anything. It'd also be enough to say you don't want to raise taxes and you want to use cash, which I've seen cities do, which I don't recommend, because you just put yourself.
Yeah.
If your only intent is to give yourself a 1 or 2 year reprieve, it doesn't help, because it brings cash down, yay, no tax increase, and then 3 years later, your base is down here and you need your expenses have kept going.
Mr. Simpson, is it fair to say that we could plan for having some type of ice rink, like we had talked about before, but in the meantime, maybe we could do something smaller where we just say flood an area at a much smaller reduced amount? Where it would be, how do I put this? You take just a small amount from wayfinding and just balance it out. It wouldn't be a lot. Until we get to something in the future that's more based on the comprehensive plan in there perhaps.
Yeah, we put a plan, so I don't want to not answer your question, but to put it broadly, we've put a plan together. The council has broad ability to say, we want you to do X. And then with that instruction, you can say, and we want you to not do Y and use the money for X, or you can just say, we don't want to think about it, we just want you to make it happen. So you can say, I want this certain thing to happen, and here's what I'm willing to sacrifice in the budget plan that you have. Or you can say, this is what we want to happen, tell us what that means. And so that's you've got that option through all of that. And it's the same with when you're kind of boiling down the library thing, it's the same with the library. If the council says there's a magic number they have in mind, you can say, make that their levy. Well, then you can either say, and here's where you should take the levy from, or you can say, go figure it out, and come back to us and tell us what you did. So we're just kind of showing you all the puzzles and pieces and the ingredients, and then you can tell us if you think it's about the right mix. So your specific example, if an ice rink is a priority, the council could set an amount based on whatever rationale they want, based on their own research, based on our research, based on arbitrary thoughts about what an ice rink could cost, and you could just say, we want to find a way to put that into the budget.
Yeah, I'd like to see a fair way that we could kind of accommodate that need.
I thought we already decided we're gonna do the comprehensive plan before we worry about it.
That's why, right, I agree. That's part of why I'm saying maybe there's something where a much smaller amount could just be for a temporary type of thing that's probably not considered a lot of cash.
You also have the ability, when you build up the cash like this, to see if 23 holds and get through some of your planning And then you can make a policy decision that you want to use X amount of fund balance to fund the bike and ped step 1 and the outdoor rec step 1 and 2. And you'll have some options to do that. We also don't have the, I think we talked about this, Josh, but I don't believe we have specifically identified, because it's not in the CIP yet, money for the feasibility for the fire station design.
That's correct.
So the thought is, well, we'll have the CIP discussion. If that becomes a priority, which I think it probably will, then we'll have to figure out how we fund that. That may be a candidate for a mix of fire impact fees and fund balance. It's not necessarily an ongoing expense that's gonna come back to haunt us if we use it a little bit. So I also want to let you know, we don't have all the ingredients mixed together here either. There's still some things. The library roof is not resolved in this budget. We recognize it needs to be resolved. We may have been fortunate with a hailstorm that helped resolve that issue. But not everything that we even think you want us to do is made it into the budget, based on what you think the levy limit is, what your willingness to do fee changes are. So that would be the next slide, right? Or did you go back? Did I miss, or were you just on that slide?
No, we're
Sorry.
We went back to macro and we're working our way into micro still.
Okay.
So fee changes, and I think the first two fees here are essentially repeats from the first workshop. We had indicated at the last workshop, we were going to get back to you with a recommendation for the solid waste fund and fees in there, and we've done that. So vehicle registration fee, as a reminder, we're proposing $10 per vehicle per year. You will see the first reading for the ordinance that's required for that at the October 25th council meeting, second reading November 9th. The street lighting fee, or the street lighting cost recovery system, we are anticipating that to be about $2 per residential customer per month, or $24 per year. And as a reminder, we anticipate coming back to you with a fleshed out fee structure for that July 1st, 2023. That is the implementation date that we are aiming for. There's a little bit of work ahead for us on that, but we are anticipating that July 1st, 2023 implementation, unless we hear anything differently tonight. It would then just be in the budget that you're approving.
We've got, I'm sorry, I'm just trying to make notes, chewing them up at the same time here. There's business properties, commercial properties that will have by class. Not everybody gets a $2 thing. It's $2 for residential, but it's by class based on the other.
So I'm going to attempt to answer this. I'm going to ask for Scott's help, just for the kind of the historical context portion of
I
this.
hope he said yes, because I asked him before the meeting about this, and he told me something.
Well, yes, that is what we're anticipating. That said, there are a couple of different methodologies we've employed. I think we employed a certain methodology in 2010 when we first looked at this.
Yeah.
We employed a different methodology in 2019 when we looked at this. Essentially, the work we have ahead of us between now and July 1st is to revisit methodology. Is that still appropriate? Is it still permissible? So that's where the work lies ahead. And we'll come back to you. We know what the cost is that we're going to be recovering. So we've got our numerator up there. Now it's just what do we need to do below that? How do we parse that out? And is that 2019 methodology still okay to employ? Have there been any changes where we would need to look at something differently? But when we looked at the amount of utility billing points across the community, which was kind of our rough way of looking by class, as you just mentioned, that's where we came up with that $2 per residential customer. We've got enough residential class billing points out there, which generally your billing point is going to represent a parcel within a certain margin of error. And we believe we have enough utility billing data points out there, utility billing customers in other words.
Yeah.
When you divide that into what we're looking to recover, that's where we're coming up with that $2 figure. So I think yes is the answer, but I do believe we have some work ahead of us yet.
Okay, that's fine.
So going on that straight thing, it's something you guys did before I came on it. Are we looking to get back all our costs to the electricity and maintenance and the installation of these streetlights on a yearly basis? Is that what we're to break even on having streetlights?
The reason I'm in favor of it,
No, but is that what we're looking to do?
what we're looking at doing is spreading the costs across the city where it's being used. So 49% of the properties right now are paying 100% of the bill for the streetlights because 51% of the properties in the city are not on the tax rolls. This is part of the tax roll. If we do this, 100% of the people using streetlights will pay 100% of the cost.
It brings down all spending.
But the fee basis is, the methodology both in 2010 and 19 was to take the total cost of the electricity, the maintenance, all, basically our bill from our FMU, from ourselves, and move it from general property taxes, which is 100% paid for now, to a fee.
Okay.
And right now, anything on the levy is 75% paid for by residential properties. 75% of our taxable properties are residential. 25% of our taxable properties are non-residential.
Mm-hmm.
If you bring in all the non-taxable properties, then it's different percentages all entirely. So going to a fee basis, even charging ourselves, because we're gonna charge City Hall for a fee, we're gonna charge the wastewater plant. So you're recycling some of these fees and things through. I think it was something like 55-45.
Yeah.
So your shift, it's a shift from on a tax basis, it shifts more towards commercial properties and taxing churches, the university, the hospital, school district.
Well, Main Street alone with all the lights there and then with the extras that we do, putting up Christmas lights and all that through the utility department, that'll be a big
Yeah,
increase.
and I don't think we included the decorative Christmas lights.
Well, that's a cost though, right?
That's utility.
But that's a cost.
We could, but that's not, that, we're talking about the street lighting. And you're right, when we do these analysis, that's what Josh kind of alluded to. State law says we can charge whatever fees are reasonable for what it costs us to do it, but we have to have a reasonable basis to do it and rational basis to do it. So like you said, downtown has more lights per linear foot.
Mm-hmm.
They're higher wattage, they cost more. And so when we create a class of properties, there's likely to be a downtown commercial property and they're gonna pay a slightly higher fee per linear foot. Well, we don't wanna actually go out and measure everybody's property and give them, have the fees vary by 13 cents a property. So you're just gonna create a class and it's gonna be,
That's what we did in 2010.
it's gonna be $3.50 a month for a downtown property, whereas our houses are gonna be $2 a month. And then the university, I think a lot of those properties were by acreage because we were assuming that only some of it fronts streets, some of the acreage is recreational and non. And then I think we had golf course and conservancy areas that actually either were exempt totally or paid a really nominal fee for that.
There were like 9 or 10 different classes in that.
And then there was parcel owners in 2010 that came in and said, well, we don't have any streetlights, so we shouldn't pay. And the council resolved that by saying, let's add streetlights. So we added streetlights to those areas, including the plan to redo Wasson, which is one of the areas that doesn't have lights. Paulie Cudd came in and said, I don't have any streetlights. And we said, don't worry, that'll be resolved in 2026 or whatever. And so that's how that system works. And then from a policy perspective, it's pretty easy to appreciate. From a practical standpoint, I'll remind everybody that you're recovering $200,000 a year revenue. It's from your wholly owned electric utility charging the general fund, which is then going to parse it out on a fee basis, which will include parsing out on a fee basis to some of our own properties. So I get the argument that you're chasing, but it is a net benefit, all things being equal. It's a net benefit for residential property taxpayers.
All right, I follow that. Let me go on the, if I can, I'm sorry guys, but on the vehicle registration, so we get a list from the state saying, here's the vehicles that are registered in the city of River Falls, and then we go after them for the $10.
It's added to your registration fee.
The state just
So when
cuts us a check.
you renew your tabs, the state takes it and will send it to us.
Oh,
So they keep like
They pass out
35 cents or
Yeah.
25 cents
for service fee.
for the service fee, and they literally, well, it's not even a check, it goes into our ACH.
Yep, so they'll keep 17 cents, it's ACH to us 30 days after the end of the month for which they collected it. So we collect starting, say, April 1st, we would get the check for April from the state, ACH to us by May 31st.
We don't do any policing of, did somebody with Minnesota plates park in the driveway or any of that stuff? It's just whoever is registering their plates and.
With the city of River
and
Falls
City of
address.
River Falls address.
So if you lived out in the township, you're not paying.
Right. So on this one, the equity issue is you're primarily going to be getting residential homeowners, and it's, you know, for the Simpson household, I've got sometimes 6 vehicles.
Wow.
So it's gonna be $60 a year added on, and I'm not in St. Croix County. So like the Morissette household, you're already paying
5.
something for, is it $5?
No, it's $10 for 5 cars,
Okay.
my fleet.
So your household for 5 cars, garage in River Falls,
Yeah.
you're gonna pay an extra $20. 10 is gonna go to St. Croix, and 10 is gonna go to the city, or $9.83, whatever is gonna go to the city.
So where's this fee going to?
This is gonna be used for street maintenance.
Okay,
And that's as required in the statute, so it'll be general fund
100%
revenue.
goes into,
Yep, general fund revenue for the purposes of offsetting street maintenance costs, so.
Yeah, the maximum we could raise with this fee is the 650,000 or whatever that we spend on street maintenance in a year, so.
so we're saying there's 9,500 cars unregistered in River Falls?
Yes.
Wow.
And that's pretty good for a college town, because typically
Well, but most college
we've
kids
got a
are,
lot of college
living here.
cars that aren't necessarily registered here.
yeah,
3 of mine.
Commuters.
Although Minnesota, there is incentive because of the fees in Minnesota, there is incentive even with our $10 wheel tax. It would be cheaper to register your car in Wisconsin. Because I think Minnesota, I don't know what, we were talking about this at city manager group last week, and I think for some of them that have the same number of kids as me, you know, their bill to register all the cars in a year is like $1,000 or $1,200 or something.
Based on value of the car.
That's right.
when we lived in California, believe me, I know what it was, expense was, so.
And so I guess just as kind of to set an expectation of what you'll see at the next 2 council meetings. So the vehicle registration fee will come through as an ordinance. It will prescribe the $10 fee in the ordinance. Any future amendments to that fee would require come back as an ordinance. The street lighting fee will come through as an ordinance that will be written fairly generally. So it's going to create the chapter within the municipal code to create the special charge, and then we will set those charges for July 1 implementation through resolution once we get into 2023. So we're going to take our time, make sure this is fleshed out, come back to you where we'll amend the fee and license schedule with the charges, the special charges, and then that'll be done via resolution. So this first ordinance you'll see for that fee will be fairly broad in nature, just permitting us to impose that.
Your budgeted revenue includes the commercial in there, or is that only residential?
Yeah, so what we're doing is, because it's a July 1 implementation, we went in, we looked at our actual costs. So we've got a cost center within the general fund where only this charge is accruing. So we know what that number is. And so what we've done then is we've taken that and we've reduced it by half for 2023, assuming mid-year implementation. And then for 2024, it is the full amount.
And that's everything, that's commercial, residential.
As Scott mentioned, it's basically the electric utility passing on the cost for these unmetered streetlights to the general fund.
Mhm.
So it's fine there, so.
And it doesn't include much of any admin on our part. So that's another thing we have to, when we set the rates, the council will have to not struggle, but we'll want to know from you, how much do you want to recover for finance and insurance and anything else? Or do you want to just focus on passing through the direct cost? And essentially then the levy is going to eat all the overhead. So do you want to try to get 100% of everything in, or do you want to just try to pass through the main stuff for now and worry about that later? That's the kind of thing we have to flush out in the rates. But I think so legally, vehicle registration fee and budget approval are going to line up the same timeline, right? So we're not going to be, staff is not going to be surprised if you change your mind, because those are done about the same time. Street lighting fee is one where you're assuming revenue, but you're not going to pass the final fee ordinance probably till April of 2023. So we're going on some faith that if you include it in the budget, which you're going to do first, that you'll pass the fee structure, understanding that we don't have any way to hold you to that, nor were we going to try to embarrass you or force you or blame you into doing it if you decide in April that you looked at our memo and you don't like it and you're not going to do it. But just know that we'd have a $200,000 hole in the budget that has to be resolved. So if there's a lot of reservation, we'd rather not pass it in the budget. And we can come back to it, but I haven't heard yet that there's huge reservation about it. You want to quickly touch on solid waste then, or did?
Yeah, and so we're proposing, so Christine, our senior financial analyst, put together an analysis where we looked at the solid waste fund. And as you know, we've got two revenue streams coming into that fund. We've got the core fee and we've got the garbage and recycling fee. And when you parse out the revenues from those fees and the associated expenses of those fees, and as Scott actually just touched on with this discussion about street lighting, there are billing fees, there are overhead costs that go into this fund as well. And when you apportion those out between the two fees and their associated expenses, what we found is that the core fee is actually covering its costs right now. We do see a shortfall on the garbage and recycling side. So right now, as you know, that's $17.50 per month. And when we did the analysis, Christine did the analysis, and we were kind of playing around with scenarios of what dollar amount gets us to basically sustainability for this fund, because as you know, there is a deficit in this fund right now. $19 is kind of that sweet spot, or that per month. Yep. And so I'm gonna elaborate on that quite a bit here. So kind of our background, core fee we know is $1.25 a month. Garbage and recycling we know is $17.50 per month. The current fund deficit as of October of this year is about $85,000. So we analyzed cost recovery activities as I just described. And again, as I described, core fee is sufficient for covering its portion of the costs. It's the garbage and recycling side that we discovered is actually not sufficient. This does include billing fees from the electric fund. So similar to the electric fund passing on costs for those unmetered streetlights to the general fund, it's also passing on billing. Basically, it's like a fee to prepare the bills. Those are charged out through the electric fund, and it's assessing portions back, not only to the solid waste fund, but to water, to sewer, to storm. And so there's billing fees in the solid waste fund. There is utility cost for I believe it's a light that's out at the compost site. There is an electric cost associated with that. It's not a lot, it's $65 a month, but that's also in this fund. And then overhead costs and insurance. So when you apportion that out between the two revenue sources, core fee and the garbage and recycling, and we kind of played around with the revenue assumptions for the garbage and recycling fee. Again, as I mentioned, we landed on that number of 19 is what we believe would allow us to eliminate the fund deficit in solid waste in 2 to 3 years, barring significant unforeseen cost increases or revenue decreases. So if I actually backtrack on that slide 1 up from recommendation to future variables, that's where, composting expenses, the contract with advanced disposal in 2024 and 25 are kind of these unknowns that are out there that may affect our assumption about $19, but we do feel pretty good that that's the number that we're recommending to get out of the deficit in 2 to 3 years. That contract with advanced disposal does increase to $18 in 2023. So the fee is essentially $1 above the advanced disposal contract amount. And then in 24 and 25, there are increases that are tied to the consumer price index, but in any event, no less than 3% for both of those years. So those are those variables that we tried to take into account when saying, okay, we have a hole right now. What do we need to set the fee at to least have on a per year basis, positive revenues over expenses, and how long do we then project it'll take us to climb out of the deficit that we're in? And that's what we're recommending.
Can I ask
Go ahead,
can I
Todd.
ask a question about the contracts? 3%, well, let me put it this way, with fuel costs the way they are, I can't believe that's the real number.
I mean, I would expect, so it's
said no
CPI
less.
or 3%. So
Yeah.
I would expect higher.
Yeah, no less, they're gonna go.
Yeah, I don't see how we can keep a contract.
Yeah, we're either lucky or good the way we negotiate the contract.
Well, but it says no less, so
But I
that
mean,
just means they're gonna.
I know they wanted, when they negotiated with us, they wanted that language in every year. And we said, no, our customers want a little more predictability for the first few years of this, so that's what we came up with 50 cents a piece. Because otherwise it would have been, like our neighboring communities, they have a CPI and they have a fuel surcharge built into their contract, and so some of their garbage fees are going up like $2, $3, $4 just to waste management.
But the way this is
Garbage
worded
not gonna
at
get less.
3% minimum, they can go infinite.
Well, it's not infinite because it's a specific CPI. So it's like the All Urban Consumers Midwest Index. It's a specific Bureau of Labor statistic.
So it's not just fuel then.
No, it would be, I think it's the all consumer one.
CPIU.
So to the extent that can go up infinite, yes, but it's probably not gonna go up more than 8 or 9%.
Yeah, right.
And so, Christine, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think, when we developed the recommendations at 19, if we assumed no changes to the advanced disposal cost, no changes to composting, we were actually looking at cost recovery of less than a year, I believe. But it's when we factor in these variables, we're thinking, okay, it's gonna be more like 2 or 3 years out for that.
And we figured the council would be fine having a plan for sustainability, not necessarily saying, let's get the 85,000 out of people's pockets right this year. Which you could take it to 20 and get the fund positive, but we thought we got into it over a few years, we can probably climb out of it over a few years, and it's a little easier on people's pockets.
So that's fine for the status quo for the current compost site.
But is it? Because, the compost site compared to a year ago is way different now.
That's my point I'm getting at,
Yeah.
is that,
The new status
what's the
quo-
plan?
This is satisfactory for the new status quo.
Can you plan?
Limited hours, us paying for grinding, but us not allowing a lot of the tree debris and things to come in.
So we're not gonna change, we've got no plans to change, we got no other solution for the compost.
We have a plan to come up with a plan.
Could you use, for your plan to come up
Which
with a
might
plan?
include
Could it take
different
funding?
location, different methodology, contracted, countywide, regional. We're putting together a plan
So Scott,
that's not expected to be in place until the next 2-year budget.
could TID funding for that type of plan be part of that conversation then? For the compost site?
It would be a stretch, because I don't know if,
I'm just trying to see if it could meet in between and,
you don't
and lock in
know
price,
we
kind of
can
like you're talking
use tax increment for relocating this compost. Potentially we could if we did a redevelopment. I'd say that's a long shot.
Okay.
Compost, we're just gonna probably have to come up with some kind of self-sustaining, we're gonna have to come up with a model where we can predict our expenses and then have a debate about, is this a public good that we want to pay for through levy? Do we want to add to fee? Do we want to not offer the service? I mean, that's not the road we're going down. I haven't heard any council people say that everybody's fine with us getting rid of compost sites, so
Be more pissed
that's
off
not where we're
than the
headed.
racetrack.
Do we have any idea, I don't know where to find it in here, but what are our costs, projected costs annually for the new compost, or the compost as it is now, with a part-time person down there releasing it?
We'd have to dig into that and get back to you with the detail.
It's in the solid waste, but it's rolled in with electronics recycling and spring and fall yard waste and our monthly payments to waste management, so. But we can get, we have the detail in our department submittals, so we can provide that.
Are you looking for just that portion of the cost?
We'll just, the solid waste one, just break them
I'll break
all
down
out.
in general, absolutely.
But,
If you share it.
so I think I was clear on that. We're not expecting to solve compost or have anything really big change in 23 or 24. Goal would be, and if we can get the analysis done sooner, that'd be great. But the goal would be to get the analysis done in time enough to be able to do something potentially for 25, 26 budget.
Right.
So people are gonna pay more, and they could argue that they're getting less service than what they did in 2021, they probably have to go back to the city, they got substantial different amount of service. Those folks in town who like to take their can of grass clippings on Tuesday and Friday and dump it, they haven't been able to do that.
Yeah.
And they are paying the same amount. They have the same access overall to get rid of that same amount of yard waste, they just have a less convenient way to do it. And unless the council tells us it's a higher priority than we think it is, it's not at the top of our list to get an immediate solution to. We think the current system seems we're gonna find out through the season here too, right? How we can handle
I
it.
think most people are happy with the extended hours.
Yeah, I haven't had any complaints.
Yeah.
It's not been difficult for the attendant, so I mean, moods are reasonable. We haven't had a whole lot of.
By the way, he does a nice job.
I was gonna say, I had positive feedback to him about the other day. Always happy, smiling, how you doing?
Yeah, we always tell college football, and he's a good guy.
So that's the scoop on fees.
All right.
We better keep moving, because
So again, this is a review of information we went over at the first workshop, so I will
why don't we skip capital and just
skip it.
we got the
So-
sheets, you know what? I think you've heard this a few times.
So planned borrowing, I did just want to mention this because this factors into the conversation we were having earlier about levy limits and fund balance and such. This is, as of right now, kind of the anticipated or planned borrowing over these next 2 years, and you can see the breakdown of what that's for. So we're anticipating $8.5 million at least for biosolids facility, will likely be a 2023 borrowing. Possibly no less than $5 million for Man Valley Corporate Park for a portion of the costs in 23. How much of the total cost for Corporate Park is split out between 23 and 24 really depends again on the design information we receive as that process unfolds. I did mention the prior year TID 15 and TID 16 advances, and there's the $1.4 million I referenced. And then a tractor backhoe of $110,000 for 23. And a street sweeper totaling $225,000 in 2024. So that's as of now the planned borrowing for the next 2 years. So then just quickly, tax increment highlights. This is something we point out in our budget workshop. So I selected a few that I thought were worth calling out. So TID 5, we have increment as of now totaling $30,352,000. We do have budgeted transfers to the general fund of $497,477 in 2023 and 2024. TID 10, which is our Sterling Ponds TID, is increment totaling $32,325,400 with a budgeted transfer to the general fund of $448,464 in 2023 and 2024. And these are I guess typical practices that we've employed here as a city. We have TIDs that have received prior year advances. Those are then repaid to the general fund in the form of budgeted transfers for interest. The principal is really more balance sheet activity, but if you look at the general fund from a fund balance perspective, those principal repayments add to the general fund's unrestricted fund balance. The interest portion of those advance repayments do come through the budget process. They are budgeted as transfers to the general fund. So again, that's a longstanding practice that we're just continuing through the biennial budget.
Because we seeded those with general fund money.
Yes.
So all millions are balance sheet, but only the interest portion is hitting the revenue. So if you're worried about like, what's the sustainability of this, if we don't have any more successful TIDs, it's not that there's $1 million hole in our revenue budget. It's the interest is what the hole would be if we don't have other TIDs or other things paying.
Yeah.
So the million looks like, whoa, that's like the cliff, but it's the interest portion, which is substantial even still. I mean, I don't know what it is, the principal and interest, but it's, so there's 150,000 or something of interest there at least.
Yeah, and so it actually goes back, Councilmember Moore said a little bit to our conversation about that fund balance. So one of the things that 2022 decrease we anticipated as part of the fiscal plan, one thing that does not include would be TID advance repayments that would just come through that as balance sheet activity. So that's what I mentioned, we're kind of tracking to where we don't actually think we'll end up utilizing all of that 355,000, and that also does not, as a matter of being conservative, does not take into account the principal portion of those advance repayments, which again just come through as balance sheet activities.
Yeah.
So.
Okay.
And then TID 17, which is our Tattersall TID, we're at increment of $5,645,600. And really what I want to point out here is with these newer tax increment districts is we obviously established development agreements where we have the pay-go development incentives. Increment comes in, we're paying a portion back out in the form of the incentive up to the total called for in the agreements. That's our pay-as-you-go structure. Anything above and beyond that, actual project costs of the tax increment districts, we'll plan on bringing back as supplemental appropriations once we get into 23 and 24, because they're so development dependent, that rather than try to actually incorporate those into the budget here, we'll just bring those back on an as-needed basis as supplemental appropriations. And you've actually seen some of that already this year in some of our council actions we've had you take related to development. So that practice will just continue. So what wasn't included in the biennial budget? So the second year funding portion of the Main Street Corridor Plan, so we have funding for that plan in 2024. That second year portion would actually be then pushed off into the next biennial budget, 2025 and 2026. New recreation facilities were not included, so we discussed a little bit of that earlier. Department staffing requests that were received other than the Public Works FTE that's included in this budget. Library building updates, and the fire station feasibility study that Scott mentioned earlier. So those are not included in this biennial budget.
And there's lots of things, other things that are not, but those are the ones that we thought we've heard you talk about, we may have talked about. I just wanted to point out that they're not in the budget. Or you might hear departments saying, hey, I requested an extra employee and Scott didn't put it in the budget. Yes, that's correct. There was several. So, they're awesome pie charts.
Yeah, we can just move on. Move right right on. They're in your, you got them in your handout, so. Process and next steps. So council action. We'll be asking you to approve a 2-year budget totaling $96,910,201. They'll be in the ordinance language, you'll see they're approved by functional area and fund. So within the general fund, we have a number of functional areas that you're adopting the budget at that we will keep in mind when it comes to actual versus budgeted expenses. And then for the rest of our funds, they're approved at the bottom line fund level. And then you're ultimately granting authority to staff to implement that plan on your behalf. And you will be appropriating fiscal year 2023. So we're adopting a 2-year budget with the appropriation language that you'll see in the ordinance for fiscal year 2023. You will also be approving a levy for tax year 2022 collected in 2023. So as you know, just as a reminder and for the recording, in Wisconsin, those property taxes are collected in arrears. So it's based on your 2022 property value. And so that levy is $7,511,253, which, as I mentioned earlier, gross increase of 5.27%, net increase when taking into account net new construction of 2.59%. And you'll be in the ordinance authorizing the levy on taxable properties in the city. Draft 2023-2024 budget can be found on the city's website. At City Hall, we'll be distributing to the library. And as a reminder, you'll have a first reading of the ordinances October 25th, with a second reading on Wednesday, November 9th. Due to the election, that'll be a Wednesday meeting. And then you've got our contact information for additional questions, and I will follow up about solid waste fund.
Great job, Josh. I'm happy to talk about the library if you want to. I do want to note that the budget book is not the legal budget. This is my plan presented to you on how I plan to spend the money. You are authorizing, when you pass the budget, you're authorizing the fee schedule, you're authorizing the levy, and then you're authorizing expenditure by functional area as established by the state of Wisconsin. So general government, conservation and development, public safety, public works, and
It's health and human services, which we have a little bit of.
so you'll approve a big lump sum for each of those. You'll technically also approve the enterprise budgets to the extent that you're approving the fee schedule to continue and that we have to have expenditures within the fees. So that doesn't mean that I am not interested or Josh isn't interested in comments you have about individual budgets, but I want to set the expectation of the level. Like if you come and say, well, I think you should lower the operating expenses in parks by $10,000. Okay, I can try to do that, but you're authorizing these categorical things within, and so then we're kind of making not a contract necessarily, but we're making a commitment that I'm going to get those services provided with the dollars that we're planning to spend. Capital projects are a little bit more specific or precise. If you really have things you need to not do or do, that would be good feedback. If you see typos or things that don't make sense to you when you're reading it, like nobody's going to know what the finance director's talking about here, that's good feedback for us too. So to the extent you're interested in looking at the actual budget book and giving us feedback, we're happy to take it. But I do want to just put the caveat in. Sometimes it's like people going through the line items and all of it's transparent. We're happy to talk about every single line item. Just keep it in mind that you're not approving supply expenses of $27,290 for the recreation department. That's the plan that I'm trying to hold the department heads accountable so that when we add it all up at the end of the year, we haven't overspent what we're doing.
Oh, sorry. First, apologies for being late. I know I asked you guys to push the meeting back and it was still late. Can things change in between first and second readings or?
Yep.
So it can't, after as soon as we approve it after the second reading with discussion and motions and all of that, that would be.
You're gonna approve the ordinance, which has the general government, all that stuff.
Right.
So this can change even after that.
Okay.
Josh and I may look at what the council approved. We might do additional analysis on something we didn't have time to do. And we might say, oh, we actually are gonna need more money for compost site. We're gonna have to talk to Public Works about how we're gonna have to not do some tree trimming or something to make that work, so.
Okay.
From a practical standpoint, this can change afterwards. We don't do much changing because once we have this, all the pieces kind of woven together, we wanna have a reason to make a change. But once you pass the ordinance, that's what's levied, that's what's collected, and then we go forward.
And once we get into the fiscal year, there is the ability to amend the budget with a 2/3 majority vote. I have not seen that we've done much of that even here historically, and I think the reason for that is, as Scott alluded to earlier, we are authorizing budgets at such a higher roll-up level here that it's often kind of unnecessary. Sure.
I recall getting budget adjustments. They were not significant, they were like less than 100. Yeah, they were.
A lot of times it's a fund to fund.
Yeah.
So we're making special revenue funds and some of those things, sometimes there are things that come off. The general fund is not gonna change much. The other thing that you're not gonna change is I don't know how, I mean, you could, I suppose, but the levy for the library, because in essence, the law says you're giving them a sack of money and saying, good luck. You know, you have a full determination of how big that sack of money is, but once you give it to them, once it's authorized through your budget process, it's their money to do what they want. So Tanya's is the same as mine. She's saying, this is my plan, but legally, they can buy an $850,000 motorhome with the money and go all mobile. You know, that is within their purview as a library board to do that. So they're making, just like I don't spend stuff on things that will surprise you, the library board is not likely to do that, but legally they have the ability to do that. So, and the library is a complicated, loving relationship, in which we've had 3 biennial budgets, maybe 4 biennial budgets, and 3 fiscal plan revisions in which the city administrator has been waving his arms in the air, saying you ought to think about what the long-term implications of your revenue cliff is, because the city's commitment has been pretty substantial. It's going to continue, but it is not going to raise at the level that you would like it to raise. You ought to think about making some adjustments in 2010 or 12 or 14 or 16 or 18 that will head off the obvious inflation and cost that's going on. Some of which is very challenging for them to control because they have a huge facility. I mean, if you look at a survey, I think it's pretty easy to draw the correlation between expenses. The giant libraries like Menasha, like 46,000 square foot library, it's really expensive to heat and plumb, and those buildings are really expensive. This is a jewel of the city. It costs a lot of money to operate just the building itself. And if they keep the lower level open, they don't have a good way to back the revenue, I don't think. And so I've suggested, again, I think fairly tactfully and professionally for a number of years that we ought to think of something. And for the last number of years, they've said, we'll figure it out when we get there. And so here they are, and their answer is just give us more money. So, which you have the ability to do if you want. But I didn't give them. I have recommended that you give them more money than what we had in the fiscal plan. So, and which is arbitrary. I appreciate that there is no science to 10%, 12%, 1.5%. But the library is getting 11.4% of the levy, and then I use 88.6% to fund everything else. So that seems pretty reasonable to me. It's a pretty enviable position for them with other libraries, even if they are not suggesting that's the case. I talked to a lot of city administrators and I know that they kind of have cartoon eyeballs when they see 1.3 million. So, and they didn't include the county, which is a big thing here. We've got, by fully charging the building costs to the library, they're getting all that at 115, 110. They're getting the money from, they're getting huge amounts of money from the county based on the cost of circulation and based on the cost of the buildings. So by other cities eating the cost of the building, it also reduces their county reimbursement. It's not a very smart strategy. But I can only manage one community at a time. So what they do with their charges are up to them. And I also offered the library that if, and I meant this sincerely, if they can replace the services that we provide for $180,000 a year, by all means do it. And then I will reduce my FTE accordingly. I don't think they can, they know they can't buy it for that amount. So it's not a net. I don't know where the net comes from. It's like you have to cut payroll checks to people, you have to insure things. Those are expensive, and they have huge IT needs, and we're happy to supply those needs. So my recommendation, I think I went as far as I thought you would want to go. Give them a little bit more levy to try to ease the inflation, but that just meant we had to reduce the levy somewhere else.
Well, my understanding from Tanya is that she's accepted the proposed budget.
Yeah.
And that this is, but that this is not sustainable. So it seems to me that's maybe a different question than a, this draft budget.
It's not sustainable if they're unwilling to address the cost drivers in their operations. I mean, I get it. If they want to just keep the same staffing, the same hours, it isn't gonna work.
Right. But yeah, I guess other than more money, maybe be creative.
So they may in fact get more money. The county reimbursement may go up because other libraries are trimming hours and things. And so every time those patrons shift to us, we have a circulation increase. It goes up, but if you look at their circulation numbers, they're not going up.
The pandemic.
So we've maintained our funding level even while circulation, the service level has not dropped. They're still providing great service, but they're doing less of it, relatively speaking. And I think our budget reflects, I think the fact that I think we essentially start with the library and give them their levy and then use the rest to figure everything else out. That's from a practical standpoint, what I do in the budget. That's a good spot to be in. It demonstrates that the library is a priority. I get that it doesn't feel like that to them because they're not getting what they want, but that's not a lot different than the other department heads. Everybody is special.
It'd be nice to have a fire station.
But I think we can work with them on.
Maybe we
some
can put them
things.
in the basement.
Yeah, there you go. So I'm committed to helping them. The capital, we have to figure out, the growth needs to be figured out. They can't afford to just eat it in their operating budget. Yes, I am. I'm very hopeful that we're totaling the library's growth
So that's,
at actual replacement value.
God bless Daniel's term.
Well, and the fact that there's no mortgage in the library anymore helps.
Yeah, it's kept their costs down. Because we're not charging them debt service anymore either, that I'm aware of, right? There's no debt service, so we've actually helped them reduce their expenses.
But according to, I don't want to go too far on this, but they haven't created any sinking fund for any maintenance issues there either, have they?
we kind of started to build that up with our fund balance, but now they're proposing to use it for operating. So that, we know how that goes too.
Run out of
Well,
bullets.
they have about $140,000 in fund balance right now.
All that beautiful space downstairs is not used.
Yeah, that's part of the solution. There's gotta be a way to generate some revenue somehow off of that.
I mean, it's been over 2 years since they've done anything downstairs.
Yeah.
Meeting.
That's what they told
meetings
me,
and stuff.
over 2 years.
Yeah, I mean, I think they've had some $150 rentals, for a couple hours, and that's about it, so. I'm committed to working with them as much as they want my advice. The rest of our team is also. And I think they now sound committed to thinking differently about the lower level. I think for a long time they said it's gotta be part of the library, it has to be the library. The reality is you can't staff 2 levels efficiently unless you have something generating, some kind of service or programming that's doing it. And so the library is beautiful, it's huge, but it's a lot of square footage to maintain.
Just that twice.
Just with a little bit of knowledge that we teach, here's the news for society.
So I think if it's okay with you,
Oh,
batteries might be running low for some staff, 2 meetings, 2 nights in a row, but we're happy to keep plugging away. I expect to have some good news related to kitty corridor planning and all that in the next 2 days, so. Amy Peterson's at a meeting tonight, Jason's at a meeting tonight, another location, so. We've got people stationed all over the city trying to figure things out. And you know where to find Josh?